I show in a way, a happy city. I mean, I was told over and over again, well, that's not the way we think of Istanbul. Mm. I was asked, could you add a few bombs to it?
Wow. They want these kind of sad stories, right?
Yeah, they want the sad stories. I don't have any sad stories. I like funny stories.
Welcome to Pop and Politics, your guide to art and culture in Turkey. I'm your host, Kenan Behzat Sharpe. Each week we host an artist, musician, director, writer, actor, or other creative worker in Turkey. And today we are joined by writer and novelist Nektaria Anastasiadou. She was the 2019 winner of the Zografeios Agon, a Greek language literary award founded in the 19th century Constantinople. Her debut novel, A Recipe for Daphne, was shortlisted for the 2022 Runciman Award and longlisted for the 2022 Dublin Literary Award. It was also a finalist in the 2022 Eric Hoffer Book Award and the 2021 Women's National Book Association Great Group Read. Her writing has appeared in various literary journals, including the Markaz Review, and she has recently finished a novel written in the Istanbul Greek dialect. Nektaria, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. So I wanted to ask you, of course, about Recipe for Daphne. Mm-hmm. So it's a really interesting book. You have these characters from the Greek community of Istanbul, of different generations, the things they experience and go through. You also have really interesting stuff about the culture of this community and cuisine and food and things like that. So I want to ask you about, the origins of the novel, why you decided to write it, and for viewers who haven't read it yet, just a little bit about the story.
So I'll start with the origins. About 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, yeah, something like that, I was living in a flat on Faik Pasha Street in Çukurcuma. And one night I took out my notebook and I started describing the street, but not from my perspective, from the perspective of an old man who had lived all of his life on that street and who had seen all of the changes, who had seen the pogrom in 1955, who had seen his many neighbors deported to Greece in the 60s, who had seen the neighborhood fall into disrepair and then get fixed up and trendy again. And at the same time, I heard about a pastry called the balkanik. And I heard about this actually from a bishop who passed away recently. He loved talking about pastries and all of the pastry shops that Beyoğlu used to have. He would say he took a step and there was a pastry shop. He took another step and there was another pastry shop. He talked about a pastry that was something like an eclair, and it had all sorts of different flavored creams inside, and each cream represented one of the Balkan peoples. And so the pastry as a whole represented harmony between the various Balkan peoples. So I knew that I wanted to write about a pastry like that. That's how my character, Kozmas, the pastry chef, came into being. Actually, the main character of the book, I forgot to mention his name, Fanis Paleologos, he was the old man who lived on Faik Pasha. And I also was thinking at that time about one of the problems within the minority. If you want to marry someone from within, it's pretty hard because there are so few people. So I thought that some woman is going to have to come from outside because, if that woman existed already, you would already know her. So we had Daphne, who has Rum heritage, but she returns from the United States to spend the summer with her aunt. And so that's how they came together. Fanis and Kozmas are both smitten with Daphne. Although I will say that, in my opinion, this is by far not a romance, even though it was packaged as such. It has a love story in it, but it's really it's about finding home. It's about finding your place or keeping your place in Fanis's from Fanis's perspective, because he's exactly where he was born, in the same flat, but all around him, everything has changed. So trying to maintain your place when everything around you is changing. And I think that's something that everybody can relate to in Istanbul, because I think of even 10 years ago, how different things are from 10 years ago. It doesn't really matter what your religion is or where you were born. And many other places of the world too. It's just here it seems like things change much faster than other places.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting what you're saying about the love story element too. Even that is, deeply historical. It has all these roots in that of why it's hard to find a partner and how small the community is today. I wanted to ask you a bit about this community. So in Turkish, they're called Rum, of course, comes from the word for Roman. This community has been in this city for millennia. Can you tell me a little bit about this community?
Yeah. Well, the usual word in English is Greek. People say Istanbul Greek. I don't like to use that word because I think it makes people from outside Turkey and Greece think that these are people who came from Greece like one generation ago. So the presence of Greek-speaking people is 2.5 millennia in Istanbul. Of course, Greek was the common language of the Byzantine Empire. And like you said, in Turkish we say Rum, in Greek we say Romios, which means Roman. And the word Hellenas is only used maybe in a wider sense to, belonging to the family of Hellenes, but everybody has, since Byzantium and through the Ottoman Empire, has used the word Romios. This community, at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, was a third of the population of Istanbul. Many Muslims also spoke Greek because that was the language of a business, and especially in Pera, even 70 years ago, you would be more likely to hear Greek sometimes than Turkish. So there were that many people. Then, of course, we had the pogrom of 1955, which destroyed many homes, businesses, and many lives were not necessarily taken, but rape was quite widespread, and we don't even know how widespread because most of it was covered up since it was a shame for the family. Despite that, however, not too many people left after the pogrom. The attitude then was, okay, this happened, but it was a one-off, and we're going to rebuild, and we're going to stay.
But then there were deportations,
right?
Yeah,
the deportations, 1964. So what happened is many of the members of the Rum minority had Greek citizenship. Although they had never been to Greece, maybe their parents had never been to Greece, maybe they had a grandfather, great-grandfather, somebody. They had somebody sometime who came from Greece, but and so they had Greek citizenship instead of Turkish citizenship, and they were deported. But people were intermarried, so it might be that a husband had Greek citizenship and a wife had Turkish citizenship. In order not to divide the family, everybody would go. So many Turkish citizens also went to Greece in order not to be separated from their families. That was the big blow to the community. And then after that, you had still half of the family would be in Greece, half here, and people gradually left, and it's down to about 2,000 now.
About 2,000.
Yeah. Which is it's very small.
Yeah, absolutely. And I heard you say in another interview that even in Greece, some people don't really know this community still exists. They sort of talk about it in the past tense.
Yeah, I've seen people. I saw a Greek woman in a church once, and she's reading the names on they're called Stasidia, where the people sit. The old names of, people would make a donation to the church, and then they had their own little seat for the year. She was reading them, and we were speaking Greek next to her. And she turns to us and speaks English. She's so convinced that nobody exists anymore that even when she hears Greek, she speaks English.
Yeah, I see. And I want to ask you about the community today a bit. So I know it's a small community. People are still active trying to preserve the culture and sort of reinvigorate the community. And there's interesting events happening at different churches. And there's a new publishing house, or relatively new, called Istos. And they're republishing books that were written here and doing all sorts of activities like that. I'm curious to hear about what's happening today and what are those efforts like?
Before the pandemic, it was an extremely lively community with cultural events, far more cultural events than you would ever expect for a community of 2,000 people. Of course, like everything, it took a big blow during the pandemic, and it's gradually reopening. One of my favorite places is the Zografeios High School, which has, during the year, concerts, theater productions. It has the literary awards that I won. They go out caroling during holiday time. Their principal plays the accordion, and both students and teachers and friends follow caroling like they used to do in Pera in the old days. At Easter, they organize a trip to 7 churches, because it's an old Istanbul custom that they go to 7 churches on, actually, I think it's Great Friday. And then there are other people who organize other things to try to keep some Istanbul customs alive. There's one day where they're scraping off bark from a tree. These are actually old pagan customs that pass into Christianity, or another day where they have to go touch some rock that has sea moss on it. Old pagan things that lasted for 2,000 years. They somehow became associated with Christianity, but and then, of course, the Greek consulate has a lot of activities as well. A lot of talks, book talks, lectures, and I think it's all gradually starting again, although it's not up to the pre-pandemic levels.
I see, yeah. And I wanted to ask you, so with this community, there's not a ton of knowledge abroad, or even within a lot of people within Turkey today even. And I'm curious what kind of struggles you had when you tried to find a publisher for this book. If it was hard to get people interested, or how you had to convince them.
So huge struggles. I know people like to talk about how many publishers rejected J.K. Rowling's the Harry Potter. Yeah, I had way, way more. I counted once and I've forgotten the number because it's too depressing. I finally found, however, Hupo, which is dedicated to publishing books exactly like mine, novels exactly like mine. It's an imprint of the American University in Cairo Press. They want stories from the Middle East that are not necessarily something that supports a political narrative. And of course, mine doesn't, because I show a happy community and a happy city. And that was really not, I was told over and over again, well, that's not the way we think of Istanbul. I was asked, could you add a few bombs to it?
Wow. They want these kind of sad stories, right?
Yeah, they want the sad stories only. They don't want the sad stories. And I said, no, I can't, because that's not accurate. This takes place in 2011. The novels, even the novels that are published, are supporting the agendas, and in the newsfeed. The newsfeed also supports the agendas. Only sad stories really are welcome, I find, about the Middle East. And I don't have any sad stories. I like funny stories.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's funny too, I wonder how people see it in Greece too, because they might expect a different kind of sad story or something more depressing, whereas you show that, the community has difficulties, but they're surviving, they love their city.
Yeah, well, I've been interviewed for Greek news and then told afterwards that the sound wasn't good because they did not want to put anything positive about the community on national news. I've had that happen a few times until I finally learned through journalist friends that, that's the way. In fact, even the journalist who cut me admitted at a party a year later after a few glasses of wine that, the problem was that I said positive things about this community, and that wasn't welcome in the Greek newsfeed. It is an issue, but I don't think it's necessarily an issue with people. I just had a small excerpt from my new novel published in Greece's best literary magazine, and they accepted it within one day, loved it. So I don't think it's a problem with the average Greek, but it certainly is for the Greek news.
They have a certain narrative they'd prefer.
Yeah. But then again, there are exceptions. I had an interview in the Kathimerini, which is, Greece's main newspaper. The word, I think, eventually spreads to the right people, to the people who are welcome to who welcome a more positive message.
Absolutely, yeah. And then I want to ask you too about your new work. So I know you have written a novel in the Istanbul Greek dialect, or I guess idiom is the more correct way to say it, which is a really interesting language. And one way a lot of people know you is actually through your Twitter feed, where for a long time you've been sharing a different Istanbul Greek word every day. And a lot of them show like the real deep connections between the Istanbul Greek idiom and Turkish and other languages from the region, and how all these things fit together. So it's really exciting to hear that you've written now a book in that specific idiom, which is really different from what Athenians speak, for example, or different in enough ways. Yeah. So I want to ask you both about what that idiom is like, and also what the novel is, what we can expect.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you a bit about the novel first. The novel's narrator is a woman in her 70s who is expecting, it's the year 2016, I think. Yeah, 2016, if I'm not mistaken. She has an appointment with an old friend, an old lover, whom she hasn't seen in 40 years. They said that they would meet 40 years later. So it's building up to this rendezvous, if he's going to come, if he's not, if he's still alive, she doesn't even know. At the same time, there are various intrigues in her apartment building, which used to be an entirely residential building with Rum and Jewish families. And now, like most of the buildings in Beyoğlu, it's filled with offices. And she has a lot to say about food, about life. But she's also quarreling with her downstairs Jewish neighbor. They've been enemies their entire lives. And she has another friend, younger friend from Greece, who does not welcome some of the narrator is Athena. She does not welcome some of Athena's comments about the downstairs Jewish neighbor. So it does have to do with anti-Semitism, and which is a big problem throughout Europe.
Of course. And there are also famous antagonisms between the small minority communities of Istanbul, right? Where
there
Armenians and Greeks and Jews will sometimes quarrel and not like each other.
Yeah, they often operate in the same business, the same sort of, they compete with each other sometimes, or used to, not so much now. So yeah, a lot of, sometimes people can live side by side or in the same apartment building and understand nothing about each other. And so this novel throws them together, and they have to learn about each other.
That's exciting.
Or there will be consequences. My narrator is going to lose the friendship of her younger Greek friend, who doesn't accept this sort of racism if she doesn't reevaluate.
I see.
So it's also written in the Istanbul Greek dialect, which I've made completely accessible to the Central Greek reader. As you saw in a recipe for Daphne, I use Turkish words, I use Greek words, and work them into the text so that even someone who doesn't speak Greek or Turkish can appreciate them, and even sayings. So I was already used to writing for an audience that doesn't quite understand all of the stuff that either that I do or that my characters do. So I use those same techniques. Also, this new novel, it's written. My narrator is talking in her head to her younger Greek friend. So sometimes she can even explain in the course of, her thoughts. if there's something that a Greek reader wouldn't understand. But it is fully uncensored Istanbul Greek dialect, but yet also fully accessible. And I think that's very important because up until now, all of the Greek novels that have been set within this community, not that there are so many, but they're all written in Central Greek with a sprinkling of Istanbul Greek. And to me, that seems silly. It's like a London novel written in New York English with a few New Yorker words.
Yeah. So will this be the first time a novel's fully written in an Istanbul Greek dialect?
Yes.
Wow.
As far as I know, I have never seen anything fully written in Istanbul Greek dialect before.
That's really exciting. And how has getting this one published been? What's that process been like?
So this one is just as difficult. Well, maybe not just as difficult. So it's still proving difficult. I still find that what I thought was the success of A Recipe for Daphne and the reviews of A Recipe for Daphne were going to boost me for the next book. And it's still a struggle. I do have a publisher looking at it seriously. I had one publisher actually ask me for A Recipe for Daphne for the Greek rights, and I said, that's fine, but I've translated it into Istanbul Greek, and they, without even looking, sorry, we're not interested in any other idiom. It had to be translated into Athenian Greek in order to be, and that way they would like it, but no. And so I haven't actually had that many, I've only had one rejection so far, but it's very hard to get my book in front of the editors. It's still very hard, even though I have a nice CV now. It still takes, you have to know somebody, but I think it'll turn out. I was really encouraged by what happened with Kharji's magazine, where they took an excerpt of it within one day and told me that they loved not only the story, but also the linguistic approach. So I think if the #1 literary magazine of Greece says we love the linguistic approach, I'm going to also find a publisher who will love the linguistic approach.
Absolutely. Sooner or later, I'm sure it'll happen. And it's a historic thing to happen. I think it's really great to have this become a literary language, because that's what so many people speak.
Yes, I would
very
love
rich.
Yeah, a language has to be written really for it to survive. And I think also another very important thing for me is that often speakers of Istanbul Greek, they feel quite inferior to speakers of Central Greek. So I want to give them the confidence that I'm hoping that this novel, when it's published, it will be a boost for them. It will be reinforcement for them that they should, it's not just they can go on speaking their idiom, but they should. It should be preserved. And it is not any less correct than the idiom of Athens.
Of course, yeah. And for our viewers who can't speak or read Greek, at least they can read A Recipe for Daphne in English. And has it been translated into Turkish, or is it going to be?
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Maybe one day, hopefully.
I hope so, yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.